Well, hello everyone. I'm the director for our New Zealand not-for-profit charitable trust called Common Knowledge, and I'm both founder and the director. And I'm doing this series on you and childbirth, and today we're going to talk about birth plans, because when I gave birth in 1970 in the United States, there was no thing called a birth plan. We totally lacked choices. We had the standards of care that were the evidence-based practice of the day. Those were the guidelines to practice, and that's what we did. We went into the hospital and we had things done to us and around us. Some of them are different than what you experience today. For instance, I was shaved. You won't be. I was given an enema. You weren't. There were lots of little fiddly assessments, monitoring, and procedures. Now, a lot of people think, well, that was very foolish. For instance, let's take being shaved. Okay. Well, actually, in New Zealand in 1920, which was not so long ago, they had the highest maternal mortality rate because people didn't know about germ theory. People didn't know about washing their hands. And women died of milk fever or sepsis after the birth. And then they discovered germ theory and washing your hands. And the midwives in New Zealand and in other countries used to wash women. So the idea was that you shaved a woman and kept her clean down there because that's where the bacteria would enter, particularly after the birth. The idea of having an enema was that many women who give birth vaginally move their bowels. They didn't want women to be upset, and fecal material carries different types of bacteria they didn't want the baby to have. So these things were being done because at that time it felt that that was the safest and the best way to deal with things. So we didn't have choices. We couldn't eat, we couldn't get out of bed, we couldn't drink, but our husbands were with us. And in the United States in 1970, the very first childbirth preparation classes were taught, Lamaze and the Bradley method, and in New Zealand, Grantley Dick Reed. And so the first childbirth preparation classes were skills. So multiple millions of us went into the hospital in the United States and we used some skills. And that achieved a phenomenal change in childbirth because women were no longer suffering as they had in the millions and millions throughout time and across the globe. When we had some skills, we coped better, we managed better, we dealt with things, we handled things better, we stayed on top of things, and we felt more in control, particularly with our husband or another person who had skills and were helping us as well. And we lacked choices. We couldn't make a birth plan. We couldn't say no to medical care. And 95% of us labored because the medical profession wasn't particularly sophisticated. So if we had risks, those risks were considered to be acceptable because they knew that most risks did not become problems and that most problems didn't become tragedies. So for us, 95% of women labored, and that meant some of us had a short labor, some of us labored for days, some of us felt it was manageable, others suffered. Some of us had a good outcome, most of us did, and some had tragedies, some of us did. Some of us loved birth, and some of us swore we'd never get pregnant again. So you need to understand that times change. And skills were particularly targeted to low-risk women to achieve 3 goals: a natural birth, pain-free labor, with no medical care, no medical interventions. But not enough women achieved those goals. So there was a very active group of birth advocates that arose in the late 1970s and 80s. There's still the books today, the famous authors today, many of them still alive, as I am, and they started to say that skills aren't necessary because women have always given birth, and so we somehow instinctively know how to give birth. We've never challenged that statement. Our trust has in Birthing Better Families knew that was hogwash from the start. How many of us who have given birth actually know we know how to do it? We don't know how to become good lovers unless we learn skills. We don't know how to satisfy our physiological hunger unless we learn how to cook and to choose foods that we know are safe to eat. So the idea that women know how to birth just because we get pregnant was always an inaccurate statement. And yet it was sold to us as though it was a truth. And that's an idea. And when you have an idea and you put words to that idea and actions to that idea, try to fit it into a system, then you end up with why childbirth is so confusing today and why so many women feel that they failed to know how to birth. So today we're going to talk about birth plans. They came in the 1980s. At first, when birth plans came in, it was like reading a book. It was like wedding planning. It was every detail, because what we were being told back then is that women know the kind of birth they want. Well, having talked to tens and thousands of women across the globe, I can tell you that women want one thing primarily, and you know what that is. We want to have a safe birth for ourselves and our baby. We want to have a healthy me and a healthy baby. That's what we want. The bottom line, that's all we really, really care about. We want to have a healthy baby and we want to be healthy. And then when we get pushed to shove and ask what we want next, it's a positive birth experience. We want to be able to look back on our birth and not feel traumatized, or not feel shame, blame, guilt, anger, disappointment, frustration, or birth trauma, emotional birth trauma from our birth. We want a positive birth experience. And then it gets down into the more diddlies. We'd like a home birth. We'd like a natural birth. We'd like our husband to be the first one to hold the baby, or we'd like to be the first one, or we'd like to put the baby to the breast, or delay the cutting of cord, or have music, or have soft lights, or not be bothered, or whatever. And this became like wedding planning. So we forgot when we plan weddings that we have to live a marriage. The same way with birth. We can plan a birth, but the fact is that we're going to parent for a lot longer than our birth is. But we put a lot of time and energy into researching and writing a birth plan. In 1970, we put time and energy into learning and practicing skills. So that meant that when we went into birth, we went armed with a set of skills that may not have been great, but they were something. And we then used the skills because the idea was to use skills. Now, it was for low-risk women. So for me, if I was high risk, I didn't necessarily take them seriously, or if I was low risk and something changed, I may have stopped using them. This is where it became more complicated, because Lamaze and Bradley and Grantley Dick Reed didn't really see the forest for the trees. They focused on low-risk women in a maternity system that was becoming more standardized in a medical way. But they didn't focus on 100% of pregnant women are going to give birth. 100% of pregnant women are going to do the activity of birthing their baby, no matter where the birth occurs, who's present, her circumstances, her beliefs, the choices she has or may not have, or the changes, or what happens to her around her. Had that been said back then, we would be having a different conversation now. And I, in Birthing Better Families, said that back then. But because of the momentum of the natural birth movement, what we were saying was and continues to be shouted down. Because the belief is, the idea behind the choice-based system is that women know what kind of birth they want, and they just need to research it. And the idea was that you say no to medical interventions, and that you can achieve this natural birth, hopefully pain-free, with no medical interventions. And that now would be called a natural birth. And anything else would be called a medical birth. So even today, we hear women say to each other, you had a hospital birth, you couldn't have had a natural birth. And this is what our trust wants to stop, is the meanness that has arisen in my generation, since my birth in 1970, about the childbirth conversation. We need to honor everybody's birth. It's as simple as that. And all of us can birth better and have a more positive birth if we use birth and birth coaching skills. As my generation from the 60s to the middle 70s discovered multiple millions If you talk to people my age, they will tell you that they use some sort of breathing and relaxation skills and that they felt good about reflecting back on that. And they weren't particularly blown out by the assessments, monitoring procedures that were the standards of care. But that changed because we developed birth plans. Now, this is what happened in the 1980s. First of all, birth professionals didn't understand what women wanted because you'd come in with a list of 150 things, easily, more. I want to be able to go into the shower. I want the lights dimmed. I want to be able to bring in music. I want to have food. I want to have more than one person. I don't want to be touched during a contraction. I want to have a vaginal exam done while I'm sitting up. I mean, on and on and on and on and on. And what I discovered very early in talking to women back then is that most women, once birth labor, let's talk about, because then everybody was pretty much laboring, once labor really ticked in, most birth plans went right out the window. But it became very confusing to people. First of all, in the tens and thousands of people I've talked to, a handful of women had a birth plan that unfolded the way they wanted. Most didn't. Most people felt that their birth wasn't anything like what they planned, which meant that that was a disorientation right away. And many women, particularly, let's just use the example of pain relief, would say, I don't want pain relief because that was one of the interventions. And then it became painful because now they lacked skills, because classes in the 80s changed to information about the pros and cons of medical care and stopped using skills because we were told that women know how to birth because we get pregnant and it's instinctive. So women began and men stopped using skills. Fathers' roles were shifted from being a coach to just being a support person of the birth plan. And birth professionals didn't know what women wanted. Women didn't know what they wanted, and partners certainly didn't. Because if a woman, for example, with not wanting pain relief, and then just thought, well, that was a choice, I don't want pain relief, and then she experiences the pain of labor contractions, and she doesn't have a lot of skills, or she thinks she's using skills so she has a pain-free labor, and she begins to suffer, not cope, feel overwhelmed and distressed. Somebody may say to her, can we give you pain relief? Or she may say, I want something for the pain, to which most fathers would say, but you wrote in your birth plan. And birth professionals would say that, but you wrote in your birth plan, you didn't want any. And women would say, but I do now. You don't know what it feels like. And you're right, nobody else does know what it feels like, and you are in charge of your birth. And so then you accept pain relief, and you're glad you do. And 6 months after the birth, or 18 months after the birth, you're pissed off at your partner for not supporting your choice to have it, or not helping you get through birth because now they lack skills and don't know how to help you. And you're pissed off because you use pain relief and you feel you caved and gave in. So this is why birth plans are so fickle. They're so unreliable as for anything. Is it right for you to be asking birth professionals to give you the birth you want? Well, yes and no, but you're going into their environment. I mean, the fact is that every hospital has standards of care they're obligated to fulfill. So does your doctor. So does your midwife, whether she's trained as a nurse midwife or as a direct entry midwife. She has standards in her practice she has to follow. She has assessments she needs to do with you. She needs to keep notes. So when we believe that we can write a birth plan that says no to medical interventions, and here's a list of them, then the fact is that we can say no to some of those things, and some of those things we're okay with. And if we've tied those things into a perception of a natural birth, then no wonder so many women feel as though they fail. And this becomes the problem with birth plans. Many birth plans will say, I don't want to be induced. Okay, and if you're not induced, and if something happens to your baby, are you going to live with that? And the converse is true. If you do say yes to being induced and something happens to you and your baby, are you going to live with that? We are always having to make choices and decisions. And birth should never be about an ideology. It should be about the activity that we're doing with our baby. And that means that ultimately, we, our trust and Birthing Better Families, want you to also make a skills-based birth plan. So this is a new idea. So the new idea is that your conventional birth plan is what you want and don't want. And your skills-based birth plan are the skills you're going to use or what you're going to do. And that makes sense. They're sort of like a perfect match made in heaven. You may know the kind of birth you want. You may be able to choose who's there and where you do it and what happens to around you. But regardless of all of that, each of us has to do the activity with our baby. And every activity humans do is best done with a set of skills. Now, sure, we'd love you to learn birthing better skills, but that's not the point of this discussion. The point is that you need to learn some skills. It should be normal and natural in pregnancy to learn skills. Create a skills-based birth plan that you give your birth professionals. Have them put in their notes the skills that you've learned, whether they know them or not. And when you give birth, if your choices unfold, great. If they don't, hopefully you're going to be part of the decision making, but you're still doing the activity. So always remember to use your skills, no matter how bizarre your birth unfolds. This is your baby's birth. If you're skilled and you work through your baby's birth with skills, you will actually be ready to work through parenting right away. You won't have anything left behind. Whereas if you lack skills and you're relying on people to give you what you want and don't want, and birth does not unfold that way, and you do not have ways to cope or manage or to feel in control, you are more likely to carry those birth feelings with you. And it's harder to parent when your birth is unresolved. So we want you to look online and find different skills-based methods. Lamaze, Bradley, Grantley Dick Reed, ours, Birthing Better, Hypnobirthing, Hypnobabies, Calm Birth, Birthing Within. There are probably more of them. And then choose one or more and start learning the skills somewhere around 24 weeks of pregnancy. And practice them a little bit. You can't practice to birth, but certainly with Birthing Better skills, one of the skills is that every time you inhale, you expand inside the bones of your pelvis. And every time you exhale, you soften inside your pelvis. And so when you're just sitting there, when I'm sitting here now, every time I inhale, I can expand, and every time I exhale, I can soften inside. So this is how you practice a skill. Or you imagine being in birth, and you imagine every breath in, you expand, and every breath out, you soften. And you do that. Why do you do that? You do want to cope. You do want to feel in control of this one-off experience called birth that you can't repeat tomorrow, and you can't take a break for lunch. And the memories of it last a lifetime. And you are influenced in your parenting and your partnership and your relationship to your children by your birth. So if you have skills to work through this activity of birthing your baby, we hope your birth plans unfold the way you would like. But so few birth plans do unfold the way women would like them to. So given that birth plans are variable, skills are fundamental. And any skill you use is better than none. And if you have a birth partner in which you share birth and birth coaching skills together, then they can help you stay in control. That is so important. So what do we hope you get from this? We hope you get from this that the emphasis on birth plans has not led to the goals and the results that were desired, which was for women to say no to medical care. Birth plans were not set up for women to say yes to more medical interventions. They were set up to have more natural birth by saying no to medical care, with the goal that if you said no to medical care, that you could achieve this natural birth, hopefully a pain-free labor, with no medical interventions. And this is the list of interventions that you have to not have, and to which our trusts since 1970 and the Birthing Better Families have gone, oh my God, this is just crazy stuff. It's too hard. Women can't make it so hard for each other and ourselves to achieve a positive birth. This is crazy stuff, and this is what this series is about, is to explain this to you one aspect after another. And birth plans is one of those aspects. Too much emphasis was put on a belief that women knew what they wanted at their birth and could choose that, and that would unfold. And birth professionals should give women that birth. That's idea, words, actions, and goals. It is never going to happen. But when you have skills, even my generation in the 60s to the mid-70s, as imperfect as those skills were, in systems that lacked choices, we felt empowered because we did the activity of birthing our baby without suffering, or we reduced the suffering. That was good for all of us. So this is the new paradigm in childbirth. It's an idea that and this is the idea, it's normal and natural in pregnancy to learn birth and birth coaching skills, then use those skills to work through the activity of birthing your baby. That's the idea, that's the words, those are the actions. We hope every birth professional who is listening to this will explain that to all their clients. There's never going to be a rising up of women. Forget it. And when the women did rise up, it was a tiny, tiny percent who were very vocal and organized. So we want all birth professionals, obstetricians, midwives, doulas, and childbirth educators to change the childbirth conversation. Let it become known verbally and clearly that it's normal and natural in pregnancy to learn some birth and birth coaching skills and use those skills to do the activity of birthing your baby. And to create a conventional birth plan, try to make it reasonable, and create a skills-based birth plan that you ask your birth professional to put in your notes, so that when birth unfolds, if your choices unfold, yippee. If you lack choices, that's the way it is. And if choices change, that's the way it is. You're still doing the activity of birthing your baby. And if you're doing that activity and you look and sound like you're coping and managing and working through it and dealing with it and handling it and staying on top of and feeling in control, then your birth professional should be praising you and your partner for doing that. If you looked overwhelmed, you looked stressed, you look like you may be suffering, they can then look at your skills-based birth plan and say, you learned these skills, keep using them, because this is your baby's birth. This is the activity you're doing with your baby, and we want you to use skills. Now, why do birth professionals want you to use skills? And why aren't they telling you? Because it's been a choice-based trend since the late 1970s. So when I talk and teach birth professionals, they say, well, it's not up to me to tell our clients to learn skills. And I say to them, of course it's up to you to tell them. You know, that's how we get a societal message, is that everybody's saying the same thing, right? And they don't care if you use skills. Doctors don't care if you suffer. They'll give you medical pain relief. Or if your labor goes on and on and on, they'll, hasten it. And if it doesn't look like your labor is going to happen, you're going to have a surgical birth. And that might occur even before you labor. Midwives the same way. Actually, midwives are more entrenched in being obstructive about skills because their belief is that birth is something that women instinctively need to do. So I've seen hundreds and hundreds of midwives in practice, and I can honestly tell you they can't differentiate between a woman who's suffering and a woman who's coping. They like being with the coping women, but they couldn't explain it. They'll explain it by saying, look, she's being instinctual. And the reality is, no, she's not. Because if you say to the woman afterwards, what were you doing? The woman will be very clear with you. I was really focused on my relaxation, or I was really focused on my breathing, or something else, right? So a woman is saying, I'm using skills. And what we're saying is that we need to be telling everybody to become skilled. And birth professionals, let me tell you, birth professionals see a lot of people. New Zealand midwives, they're doing 40 to 60 births a year. That doesn't particularly sound a lot. I've been told that the Dutch midwives can do up to 120 births a lot. That seems more. But what about the midwives in hospitals, or the labor and delivery nurses, or the obstetricians, or the midwives in the hospital? They're doing mostly many, 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 many more births. So if they're only seeing 1 out of 20 women cope and 1 out of 20 fathers or others really helping, that's tiring, right? But if they're seeing 8 out of 10 women coping, which is what happened when I gave birth in the 70s, in the 60s, the mid-70s, we were all going in there using skills because Lamaze was taught everywhere in the United States. So that was the expectation. There was a very high societal expectation that we use skills. And this was such a relief from the history of childbirth in the past, where there was no concept of skills and women just suffered. So our generation felt very proud, but the message changed in the 80s. And the massive majority of women were not going to organize. That isn't going to happen now. So if you're a birth professional, it's your job now to grow a skilled birthing population, not by teaching people, but by telling them to self-learn skills and expecting them to use some skills in birth and reminding them to use some skills in birth and praising them to do that. That's your job. We need to change the childbirth conversation because we're failing each other as women. We're failing each other as mothers of children. We're failing each other as partners of men who want to help and don't know how. We are failing because we have been unrealistic with the ideas, the words, the actions. And let me show you why it's so unrealistic. This is what is considered to be the ideal birth. First of all, there should never be an ideal birth. Second of all, you can't plan it. And we're not respecting birth. We're not elevating each of our birth experiences, and we need to change that. And we do that by growing a skilled birthing population. So if you're pregnant, become skilled. If you know somebody who is, tell them to become skilled, right? Spread the word on social media. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. I have rabbited on through 400 plus videos and growing. Right? Share this link on Facebook. And tell us, what do you want us to talk about? Tell us how skills worked for you and what didn't work. Engage in the conversation. And let's broaden childbirth to include the 100% of pregnant women that will give birth, to include the 100% of women who will give birth and have to do the activity of birthing their baby. And do you know the truth about it? We do it alone. There's nobody who can do it for us. So if we're in a room with hoses coming out of every hole in our body, we're still doing the activity. If we're driving to the hospital being prepped and lying on a table, we're still doing the activity. If we have 100 people in the room, we're still doing the activity. If there's a war around us, we're still doing the activity. If we have abuse, substance abuse, or famine, or anything else, we all 100% of pregnant women have to do this activity. And we can elevate it. Us, women, can elevate it for ourselves and others when we begin to have a new conversation in childbirth, which is that it's normal and natural, learn some skills in pregnancy and childbirth, and then use the skills when you do the activity of birthing your baby. No matter where you birth, no matter who's present, no matter your circumstances or beliefs or your choices, your lack of choices, your change of choices, or what happens to around you. It's your baby's birth. You got pregnant to have a baby, not a type of birth. So do the activity with skills. and you will feel dignified and proud of yourself. And those are the memories that you will have, and that's important. So talk to you again on another topic about you and childbirth. Bye-bye.